using D3, building applications that have a lot of visualizations because we have a lot of data, and we really want to like get some insight from those. And so this is like this isn't my work. My work is not public. Because I work for a baseball team, it's a competitive environment, and obviously I can't share my actual work in public, but these visualizations are from like Baseball Savant, and one of them is like from 538. And you can imagine the type of visualizations that I would kind of do based on these sort of visualizations. Baseball Savant is, if you don't know, is a really awesome like website for data analysis about baseball, and I recommend checking it out if you're into baseball. If you're not, it's okay. First, let's talk though a bit about like what D3 is, and I like to start like my talks kind of with this, with like kind of getting an understanding of what D3 is, because I know when I was first learning it and when I was first getting started, I really didn't understand it. And because like I think people, and like D3 is famous for having this big learning curve, and I think one of the reasons is because you can't come at like, this is just like a screenshot of the homepage, and you kind of like see this, and it's really easy to see or to come to the conclusion that D3 like is a data visualization library that will make you these visualizations. And kind of the like rude awakening that I had when I first started learning it was it's like a lot more than that. And it took me a while to understand that actually. And so, well, what is D3? And really, we don't actually even need all of D3. Like D3 isn't this monolithic framework. It's not like, for example, React. This is a quote from Mike Bostock. D3 isn't a monolithic framework. It's a suite of small modules for data analysis and visualizations. These modules work well together, but you should pick and choose the parts that you need. So basically, with React, you kind of like import this like big framework, right? With D3, it's more of like a set of tools that you can use that will help you create like visualizations. It's different than like a data visualization library where you're gonna have like something like a line chart function that will just like do most of the work for you. You really have to like build the chart almost from scratch. And so what does that look like, right? Like how can we like get an understanding of what this looks like? So here's a chart from Mike Bostock, and this is from Observable. Observable is like, if you're familiar with Jupyter Notebooks, it's a notebook basically that is like running on the browser, and you can for example just like remove, like I could remove this for example and run it, and like that chart is removed, and it's pretty cool. But here, this is like an idea of like what D3 code looks like. And if you're familiar with like something like jQuery, this is kind of like a very similar syntax, right? Where you're like kind of chaining a lot of your functions, and you have like a bunch of different methods that will generate a lot of charts. And it's very different than, for example, React, which is based on like these components, these reusable components that you can like then use. And so it can be then tricky to understand like how we can mix these two together. And an easy conclusion from looking at, for example, that type of code, if you go to Observable and you want to like an example, is that we can go in here and like create an SVG element. We can create a G element and use a ref to select the node, right? And then we can then do all of that D3 like jQuery stuff that will basically output us like a chart. And this will work, but there are some consequences with this type of approach. So why is this a bad approach? Because the code is like less readable. So let's say if you're working in React, for example, like most of the like an application I'm building right now is in React, and if my coworkers aren't familiar with D3, then it can be difficult to kind of like read this code, especially if they're not familiar with D3. The code is less reusable. So because we are selecting that ref, we then need to basically create our circles, create our axes, initialize our scales, all in that like use effect hook, um, which we will then which you need to do like basically every single time. And so it's going away from this React way of like thinking, which is using like components and component composition and whatnot, which allows us to like reuse these codes, our code. And you can also run into performance issues, and we'll actually look at an example of when that happened. And it also doesn't work with React Native, right? Like because React Native doesn't have a DOM, right? You cannot make this work with React Native. With a different approach, you can, and we'll look at it later. So an example of, if you're familiar with the website RT COVID-19. So this website got some flack on Twitter, and not really by the gentleman with the tweets. These tweets are actually, by Ken Wheeler, are actually a pretty example of like what's like the performance issues with this app. And he has a really nice thread on Twitter, and I recommend going and checking it out. The gentleman who actually like had the criticism of this tweet kind of blamed the entire React ecosystem, and I'm not going to put that on here because I disagree with what he was saying. And yeah, but if you can go find it if you want, it was a big thing. But what Ken Wheeler is here showing us, and it might be hard to see, and I apologize, but basically, if you look at like the bottom tweet, all of these are basically DOM manipulations. And the problem is when you're doing this D3 kind of DOM manipulation in the browser, in React, is you're kind of like needlessly doing this, because React is already solving this problem for us, right? With its virtual DOM and its diffing algorithm. Like we don't need to do the enter, update, exit pattern that we see in D3 anymore. Like React is solving that problem for us, and by doing it the other way, you can you're basically, it's up to you to solve that problem for you. So it's a lot easier to write like less performant code when you're going about this way, instead of like letting React kind of solve this problem for you. And so okay, so how can we make this better, right? How can we improve this? So we can use React to do the rendering, and D3 to do the math. And what does that look like, right? So so with D3, we can here use it for the math. And if you're not like super familiar with D3, you can see some of like the math like functions that we're using. So we have this scale time, scale linear. Here we are creating a function that will help position and generate our line chart. And here we have another path area function. And you don't necessarily, if you're not familiar with D3, you don't need to like understand like how this works exactly, but we have like, this is how you would basically structure part of your code. And so then we can use React for the rendering. And so here we have this, we can basically like create we can create our SVGs and use JSX to basically render our elements to the DOM. And so if we see here, we have like our same path element, which is taking our path function that we created earlier, which will render those elements to the DOM. And we can already see certain patterns that will emerge, and that will make our code like more reusable. This, by the way, generates a line chart, and you'll see like what this generates in a later slide. And then we can actually create an even more like reusable pattern. So this is like a component composition pattern where you have like your line chart, which is your parent component, and then it takes like all of these children right here. And this is like a very simple example, right? But if we take this pattern a little bit further, we could actually, this is how you would create a library. So for example, if we looked at something like recharts, like this is exactly the pattern that is going on here, right? Like they have their line chart function, and then here they have their axes, and they have their axes components, and they have like their line components. And that's what, and that's basically how that library works. There's obviously this example that I'm showing you is like very simple, but with these patterns, even in our application, we can start and see how these, in our applications, how these components can then be reused. And so this is like what this would generate. And so something we also want to be careful about is our imports. So in the application RT COVID-19, like a problem that was going on was that they were importing like the entire D3 library. And they were also using things like Antidesign and Axios. And if you're not careful, that can bloat up your bundle size and can create like serious performance issues. And so actually something that they did like more recently is they removed a bunch of that JavaScript, and they reduced like that bundle size, and their application is like a lot more performant now if you go and take a look at it now. But like this is going back to that idea that D3 is a set of modules. So instead of importing like the entire D3 library, what we're doing here is we're importing the specific modules that we need in order to be able to render our chart. And so here, for example, and this also becomes a lot more readable. Our code becomes a lot more readable this way. And so, for example, if I'm looking at a component, I can tell that if you're using, like, for example, D3 shape, I can tell that already that you're making a line chart. I know that you're making an area chart. I know that you have a scale time and scale linear function. And I know that you're doing some time parsing. And so I know that you're working with date time data, and I know that you're working with numerical data already from the bat. And I know, and because date data is very rarely along your y-axis, and it's more usually along like your x-axis, I know that especially if you're creating a line chart, I can already tell that your chart is, that your x-axis is probably is probably based on that scale time function, and that your y-axis is probably based on that scale linear function. So axes. So if you watch talks from the past about D3 and React, especially when people were first making these talks, people would talk about, like, or Shirley Wu, for example, would talk about like the 3 exceptions. And they would talk about like axes, brushing, and animations, and saying that React like really didn't play well with those, so we couldn't use React for those situations. But like nowadays, like something that we can do is to create our axes, is we can actually still use, we can actually still create like an axes component and still use our axes in order, React in order to be able to do the rendering. And one helpful way of doing this is with this scale ticks function. And what this scale ticks function will do, so basically, like, we've created our y scale, And what this docx method, will do is it will create an array based on the domain of your axis of your scale function. So then we can then loop over that array and then create our axes by setting the lines and some text, basically, just like by basically setting like your normal SVGs. And this becomes like a lot more reusable, right? Like now, based on this pattern, we can then like start reusing our axes components a little bit everywhere in our applications. And this becomes a much better and cleaner pattern. Oops, sorry. Yeah, and this is basically like what that code would generate. Is this axis function, is this axis animations. So in my opinion, you should probably use some things like Framer Motion or React Spring before you go and use D3 transitions. I don't do that much animations at my current job anymore, but and I don't do like a lot of ambitious animations. But the type of animations that I do can be served with like Framer Motion or React Spring, just fine. Maybe if you want something like that's very animated. For example, when I was interning with Flourish, we were animating this like chord diagram, and we had to do all this complicated tweening and everything. And maybe for there, you would have to like reach for something like D3. But for most of your use cases, you should be able to use Framer Motion. And in fact, I remade the RT Live thing when it actually first came out, and I added some Framer Motion animations, and they work like there's a bit of, they're not as performant as I would actually like them, but they work like, especially here, they work like kind of fine. And I think the screen sharing is making them a bit like jankier than they are, but usually they work quite well. And Framer Motion is personally it fits my mental model a little bit better. I've tried React Motion and React Spring, both of them. And yeah, Framer Motion just fits my mental model of how animations work a little bit better. And I come from a background of like, I learned D3 before I learned React, and I learned, and so I think that if you come from D3, Framer Motion might be a little bit easier to get a hold of. So when should we use React? And I mean, sorry, D3. And this is a complicated question, and honestly, it probably warrants an entire blog post, and I won't be able to like do it justice in this time frame. But in my opinion, so for example, I'm very comfortable with D3, and at my work, I can't create most of the visualizations I want, because a lot of the visualizations I make are very custom. Most of these visualization libraries just are not going to cut it. And a big advantage of using D3 is that I don't have really any restrictions. My coworkers can come to me and ask me for whatever they want, and I never have to be like, well, actually, like, I don't know if I can do this. Like, I don't know how this is going to work with our charting library. Like, this would be a ton of work. I can basically like think and solve most of the problems. Now, if they want something with like WebGL or whatnot, then that's when we would probably have like a conversation about like some trade-offs and how long that would actually take. But that is one of the big benefits of using D3, is that you really don't have many limitations. And the limitations that you have with D3, where D3, for example, D3 has a lot of nice algorithms that will help you create your visualizations, where D3 does not work, where there just isn't a nice algorithm with D3. Like, there isn't an algorithm with any other charting library, because most of these charting libraries, in fact, every single one I'm showing you on the screen, is using D3 under the hood. The only charting library that I've seen that isn't using D3 under the hood is Chart.js. It's React Chart.js, and that one only, I think, has like line charts, like bar charts and whatnot, like very simple visualizations. And so you're very limited, and you're also very limited in like when you are limiting yourself with these visualization libraries, you're limiting like some of your decision making. You're limiting the type of ways you can communicate to your audience, like visually. But if you're a developer on a team and you just don't have a lot of time and you don't know D3, then these charting libraries might be a good fit for you. For example, I had a friend of mine who messaged me the other day, and he said, "Hey, I haven't used D3 in a while, but I want to make like these visualizations to like wow someone, and um, like, do you have a template or something that I could use that would help me out?" And at that point, I was like, well, if you're not going to put the time to like learn D3, because there is like a learning curve, you do need to like understand how these modules work together. Then you should probably just use a charting library and just be on your way. Yeah, and that's all I have for you. So some resources. The D3 Slack channel is like a great place to go and like learn about D3 and ask questions. I'm usually hanging out there in the React and help channels. So if you have like questions, you can go and you can ask them. I think that's a great place to ask. There's Observable and Blocks, which you can go and like find example. The book that I always recommend, and it's the book that I read to learn D3, was Interactive Data Visualization for the Web. And it was by Scott Murray, and I think it's a great book. There's other books like that I haven't read. I think like Amelia Wattenberger, or she like has a new book called Full Stack D3, which might be interesting to check out. Yeah, thank you. You can follow me on Twitter if you want. Same thing on GitHub, and I have like the remake that I did of that COVID visualization is here. That code is all online, so you can go check it out. I would really, when I remade this, I really only focused on like the D3 parts of it. So there's some, shouldn't really look at that and like assume that that's how like I wouldn't like look at there and like copy everything I did there, but I think the D3 code is pretty solid. And yeah, my slides are also online, so you can go, they're on my GitHub, you can go check them out. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks, Julian. So guys, I think an easy way for us to ask you questions is if you just want to raise your hand in the participant kind of area, and then from there, I'm just going to call you out, and you can just maybe unmute yourself and just maybe talk about your question. Okay, I know Simon had one or two questions. Simon, do you mind talking about it?